right, so we're in the car on the way back to Columbia, South Carolina from Greenville, where Democratic gubernatorial nominee Joe Cunningham unveiled his lieutenant governor's choice, Tally Parham Casey. Casey, the first female fighter pilot in the history of the South Carolina Air National Guard. She is a managing attorney at Weiss Law Firm, which has offices in Greenville, Columbia, and Spartanburg, a very prominent law firm here in South Carolina. So an incredibly accomplished nominee. In fact, a lot of the folks we spoke with at this Cunningham event indicated they felt she was far more accomplished than the guy at the top of the ticket, Joe Cunningham. But Casey gave her big political speech, her coming out speech as a politician, aspiring politician. Really wowed the crowd. She talked about the Roe v. Wade decision being sort of the thing that pushed her across the finish line into accepting the call to run for office. Again, if you're a longtime reader of FITSNews, we've written about Casey before. In the last election cycle, she was touted as a potential attorney general candidate. She declined to run in that cycle, now running in what's going to be a very difficult cycle for Democrats, but nonetheless, a very credible nominee, obviously except for some issues that this news outlet has been covering related to a family court case, a custody battle. Again, custody battles typically don't enter into the political fray, the public discourse, but this one has some incredibly seismic allegations. We're going to be getting into those in the days and weeks to come. But before we get into that, I wanted to talk about a sign that was on display at the Cunningham event. Here's a look at it. End the Geriatric Oligarchy. That's right. End the Geriatric Oligarchy. Now, what's the purpose of this sign? And again, this wasn't the only sign at this rally. There were signs that said, you know, Cunningham for governor, Cunningham Casey, people over politics. So again, this wasn't the only sign at the rally, but it was prominently displayed. A lot of folks had these, were waving them. And obviously the reason that these signs were being bandied about is the Republican incumbent in this race, Henry McMaster, 74-year-old, looks it, sounds it, some would say governs like it, is a very status quo, good old boy politician. And Cunningham is looking for sort of a contrast. He's obviously much younger, more energetic, more charisma, some would say. And so looking to draw the contrast. But here's my question about this sign. Here's my question. Let's talk about the oligarchy nationally, because national politics are going to play into this race in a big way, folks. Because if you look at the issues that people are focused on, not just in South Carolina, but across the country right now, it's the cost of life, of food, of energy, gas, you name it. It's gone through the roof. Inflation at highs, 4-decade highs. And the Biden administration's only reaction to it, response to it, has been to raise interest rates, which just hasn't worked, isn't working. So that's created a national problem for Democrats. But let's stop for a minute and think about, we just said Biden administration. Let's look at the Democrats who are running the country right now. Joe Biden, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, Majority Leader Steny Hoyer, Majority Whip Jim Clyburn from South Carolina. Folks, that is the definition of a geriatric oligarchy. And then, of course, on the Republican side, you know, Mitch McConnell, you know, old as dirt as well. But it's interesting for a Democrat to raise this because essentially you're painting both sides with the same brush. You're trying to go after your rival, Henry McMaster, but in the same token, you're calling out your own people and you're drawing attention to the national component of this race, which does not help Joe Cunningham. And again, let's talk for a minute about this race. I would love to have a competitive race for governor of South Carolina. I would love that. That means more clicks. That means more interest. A competitive race means people are involved. They're engaged. They feel like their vote matters. That's not the race we have in South Carolina, people. And in fact, it's not a race that we've had in South Carolina for a long time. For those of you who need a little refresher in history, it has been since 1998, quarter century ago, that a Democrat won a statewide top of the ticket race. It has been since 2006 that a Democrat won a statewide race, and that was the closest election in South Carolina history when former state superintendent Jim Rex defeated the Republican nominee Karen Floyd in the race for superintendent of education that year. Closest race in history. That's the last Democrat to win a statewide election. And I also want to point out the guy that won that race, Jim Rex, has since left the Democratic Party. So it's been a while. Democrats have not been competitive, and there's no reason to believe that they will be competitive in this race, even though Cunningham, many would argue, one of the better candidates Democrats have fielded in a long time, and McMaster, the incumbent Republican, arguably not a very good candidate, not a very good campaigner, was nearly beaten in his own party's primary last time he ran. So this is a race that should be competitive for Democrats. It's a race that when you look at the two candidates running, and now particularly that Cunningham has drawn a very viable lieutenant gubernatorial nominee, you think, okay, this is a race that should be competitive. But will it be? No, it won't, folks. In South Carolina, any Democrat running for office starts with a negative 10 percentage gap statewide. In other words, they're going to start at about 40%, while the Republican starts at about 50%. Which means it's virtually impossible for a Democrat to win, which again is why one hasn't won in a quarter century at the top of the ticket. So there's just no path for Joe Cunningham in this race. And that disappoints me because, again, as somebody in the media business, I want a competitive race. I want people to be invested. I want there to be a conversation about ideas that actually matters. Will we have that? More than likely not. But this event did inject some energy in the Democratic ticket. As I mentioned, Tally Parham Casey did an amazing job. She's had some serious hurdles to overcome with that family court drama, with that custody case drama. It's going to raise a lot of questions that the Cunningham campaign is going to have to answer at some point, if not from my news outlet, from other news outlets, potentially in a debate. When we're talking, folks, allegations of drug use, some other things that are going to be very problematic for the Cunningham campaign to deal with as this candidacy moves forward. Again, 99 days from the general election as of today. There are no recent polls, but again, my sense, you look at where McMaster finished his primary, where Cunningham finished his primary, probably at least a 10 to 12 percentage point advantage for McMaster heading into the general election. We'll look to get some polling on that sooner rather than later. But the campaign well joined today in Greenville, South Carolina, as Democratic nominee Joe Cunningham unveiled his nominee for lieutenant governor and pledged to end the geriatric oligarchy in the United States of America. By the way, I want to point out this is not just a campaign slogan. During her speech, Parham Casey, the newly minted lieutenant gubernatorial nominee, specifically said that there should be age limits and term limits for elected officials. You heard that right, age limits and term limits. So again, not just a campaign slogan, folks. They're actually pushing that. But as I pointed out, if they're going to end the geriatric oligarchy in this country, they're going to have to start with their own party. Stay tuned for much more of this race from FITSNews as we continue to follow these candidates on the campaign trail.